Okay, so again, I just want to welcome everybody to our October Artist Talk. My name is Katie Marshall. I'm the director at MacRostie Art Center. Thank you for joining us. And we are thrilled to have Glenna Olson as our featured artist this month. Glenna will be going through a presentation of her work with lots of images and videos, so it should be really interesting. I think we have a lot to cover, so we're going to try to hold questions to the end, but if you do have a question that you want to put out there while you're thinking of it, feel free to type it into the chat during the talk, and then we will have some time for questions at the end. And I will keep everyone except Glenna on mute during the talk just so we don't have any background noise, but after the fact, feel free to turn on videos and microphones and we will say hello. So at this point, I will go ahead and start sharing my screen and get our slideshow going. And get our little view. Okay, so let's see here. I want to get Glenna's video pinned. There we go. All right, so Glenna, I would just say go ahead and take it away whenever you are ready.
Okay, very good. Well, hi everybody. It's nice to see you all, or at least I know that many of you are there that I can't see. But what I'm going to be showing you this evening is the large majority of my work that I've done in the relief printmaking medium. But as you probably are aware, those of you who know me know that I'm a retired high school art educator. And during the time of being a teacher, of course, there's not a lot of time to produce my own work. And so that always kind of bothered me in those first decades of teaching. And so finally, in the early 1990s, I took a workshop to, implement what I learned into my classroom, of course. But it was a workshop in hand paper making over at Bemidji State University, and I was just hooked. I thought, boy, I want to do this with my students, but I want to do it for myself too. And so I entered into the arena of exhibiting and selling my work, doing pulp paintings and a lot of abstract pieces for about 8 years or so. And then I also had traveled to the North Shore in Lake Superior and saw the work of the printmaker Betsy Bowen, who's a fabulous woodcut artist, and that inspired me as well. And I thought, gee, I'd really like to learn more about that. I had been teaching relief printmaking, printing off of the raised surface of a carved block with my students for years, using linoleum as a softer substrate. But to work in wood, that was daunting to me. And so I took a workshop from Betsy Bowen and co-taught with Becky Nosbish. And of course, used everything I learned in my classroom, but really took off as an individual artist as time allowed, doing my own woodcut prints. And so from that time on, I've been producing, and not as much as I'd like. Even though I'm retired now, I'm still having a hard time adjusting to my new schedule and producing the body of work that I would like to. So we can start with the slideshow now. And so when you look at the slides, you're going to be seeing the title of the work, if it's hand-colored, multi-block, or if it's a reduction block method that I used, and I'll explain what exactly those processes are. You'll also see the dimensions of the printed image itself. And so after the slideshow, then I'm going to be kind of reviewing with you what the basic relief printing process is all about. I will show you step-by-step photos of what the multi-block process involves, as well as the reduction block process. And then finally, there will be a new print revealed at the very end of the slideshow, and it will show you the reduction block process start to finish. I actually recorded some video footage in my studio, and so you'll be actually seeing me do everything from mixing the ink to running the printing press. And so hang in there till the end and you'll get to see what that new print looks like. Now image that we have on the screen, Daylily Dance, is the very first woodcut I ever did. And I did that in that Grand Brayer Art Colony workshop, hand watercolored. And it was a good experience for me to really recognize how important the negative space was in a woodcut, because every little cut of the knife really impacted the resulting image. And so I really loved the textures that resulted. Next slide, please. Northwoods Winter. This was a print that I did, a view that I saw on my window of the car when I taught in Reamer. And I saw this little brook on the side after the first snowfall and fell in love with it. And it's very small, just 4 inches by 4 inches. Next frame, please. And then I did this large print, which took a lot of carving. It's a hand watercolored sunflower print. I grew those sunflowers in my garden, was intrigued by the different stages that they went through. And so here you see the 7 different stages. This one takes about 5 hours to watercolor it. So that is the drawback of hand watercoloring. Next frame, please. My Nana Bijou. I love to go to Nana Bijou Lodge on the North Shore. Next slide. So we have a short little Lake Superior series here. Here's Split Rock Lighthouse and Artist Point. A lot of times the people who attend the Grand Brayer Art Colony will go up, we'll have sessions of painting and drawing right out on the rocks on Artist Point, and so that's the name. Next frame, please. If you remember back to one of those first woodcuts I showed you, it was of this image. This is a woodcut I did for the Northern Printmakers Alliance, which was a new print organization that started in the late 1990s in Duluth. And we were putting out a brochure showing the different processes. And so a few of us did prints to show the work we did. So I figured out how to draw out my hand pulling an inked piece of paper off of the wood block. Next frame, please. I was commissioned to do several hundred Christmas ornaments for the Second Harvest Food Shelf many years ago. And that ornament print I actually did with the multi-block process, but the linoleum block itself was in the key block, the black print, was in good enough condition, so I continued to use it and then hand watercolored these small little prints to sell them. Next frame, please. This is the same scene as you saw in that small print, but I made the drawing bigger and tried my hand at using the multi-block process on a larger scale. Next frame, please. I grew these onions in my garden and they were drying in my windowsill after I harvested them, and I just had to get out my sketchbook. Next frame. Sunflower, another one that I raised in my garden. Back up once, I just thought of something to tell you about that. This one was created to go along with a project the MacRostie Art Center did in conjunction with a local writers group. And so this was in response to a local poet's poem about the sunflower. Next frame. Paddle at Twilight. Reduction block. I think this was probably the first reduction block print I ever did. That's where all the colors that are printed in succession off of the face of one block of wood. And I'll explain more about that later. Next frame, please. Sunset on Hale Lake. This was the view outside of my backyard window when I lived in town. Multi-block process. Okay, here's, now we're starting to see 4 prints that are identical in size, and they're all scenes from the area. This scene depicts Stony Brook, which is between here and Duluth off of Highway 2. And next frame. This is one entitled Spring. It's the view you see crossing the Mississippi River downtown in Grand Rapids. If you look to your left, if you're heading south, the library would be to the left of this scene. Next frame. And this is off of Highway 169 south of Grand Rapids, where it connects with County Road 17 and County Road 17, right? And I saw that in the fall. This is Pug Hole Lake up on Highway 38. And next slide. And those images were all part of a calendar that I did. It's a 2-year calendar for 2008 and 2009. Hand bound the cover and had Treasure Bay Printing bind the pages together for me. Next slide, please. And you can see this is what the calendar resulted in. So a person could have the woodcut as your picture for a 2-year period of time, because you could pull off winter 2007 and 2008 would be underneath of it. Next frame, please. I am a member, as I indicated, of the Northern Printmakers Alliance in Duluth, and we did some portfolio projects. And so all of the, I guess there might have been, 15 or 20 members of our group that we responded to a theme. Each person produced a certain number of prints in our edition, and then that was housed together in a beautiful portfolio and sold as a cluster of prints. We had a theme of earth, water, wind, and fire, the 4 elements, and mine was earth. And so influenced by the beautiful strata that I am mesmerized by up here on the Iron Range, I embraced those colors that I see in the tailings around here. Next frame. Okay, we also had this wonderful project. Our group, in concert with another printmakers group in the southern part of the country, merged forces, and in the year 2002, we worked on paper that was produced in the Kingdom of Bhutan and created imagery that eventually was supposed to hang in the embassy in New York City for the Kingdom of Bhutan. For some reason, that exhibit never happened, but our theme was water, female, sheep, because in their tradition, 2002 was the year of water, female, sheep, and we had to respond to that. So you see the women dancing. They're a country that has blue sheep, apparently, in the mountains, a rarity, and then you see the water droplets. And I did it purposely in a form of a mandala, because that's indicative of the Buddhist practices, and that is reflected in the artwork of that culture. Next slide, please. This was a project of the Northern Printmakers Alliance, as well as a poetry group, and somebody had written a poem about peas, and so I responded in kind. The next one is Girl in the Goblet. Our Northern Printmakers Alliance did an alphabet show. I got the letter G, so it's my self-portrait in a goblet, also starting with G. Next frame, please. And then I did some figurative pieces. So this is a hand-colored woodcut, and next slide. And then I was taking a drawing workshop and was encouraged by my teacher to say more with less. And so influenced by some of the prints that I had seen by the great Norwegian sculptor, Gustav Vigeland, who was a printmaker at night after he sculpted all day in stone, he did these wonderful woodcuts, and with the human figure, he was very minimalist in his use of line. Next frame, please. And then Despair is the same image we saw 2 slides ago, only it's greatly simplified. Next slide, please. And I have been known to get out of the car and sit in the road ditch and sketch. One year I happened to see lady slippers. I've never seen them before. I've never seen them since. But I sat and sketched them. I have kind of this little funny rule that when I'm going to do a woodcut, I prefer to sketch on location as well as photograph the site. And then those 2 experiences come together as I rework the composition in my studio. That's what I prefer to do. I feel like I need to be at the site and experience it. Next frame, please. My mother actually grew grapes around her back deck, and I just thought the vines were so beautiful. And so I sketched them and photographed them and worked and worked and worked to create a composition. I initially printed on white paper and watercolored the grapes, the deep blue that they were at Mom's house. And next slide, please. And then I also did some prints of that same image on an ivory colored paper and changed the grapes to burgundy. And I kind of like the warmth of this a little bit better, I think. Yellow Girl Bay, it's a scene on Lake of the Woods, but of course it could be any northern Minnesota lake. Reduction block woodcut. Next frame. I received a couple of commissions, one for the Rife Center dance program many years ago to make some little Christmas ornaments sold in conjunction with the annual Nutcracker. And so what's kind of fun about this one is it features the silhouette of my daughter who was dancing as the Sugar Plum Fairy in the Rife Center Ballet one year. And then giving and receiving, this was just a few years ago, ornament commissioned by the Second Harvest Food Shelf. Next frame. Sprouting garlic. I guess a lot of people don't like it when their garlic shoots sprouts, but I found it rather pretty. And so I sketched it and drew it and printed it, a lino cut. Sap gathering. I married into a family where we harvest maple syrup and make our own, or harvest maple sap and make our own syrup. And I just think it is the most wonderful process. Next frame, please. I took a class from David Dobbs a couple years ago at the MacRostie Art Center and learned this really cool method of printing called pressure printing. It's just cuts strips of paper that are cut and glued onto a piece of paper. And that is what created the background, what looks like the forest. And then on top of that is a linoleum block print or a lino cut of a deer who I happened to see grazing out the window of our home on our first morning waking up at our location out here in Cohasset. Next frame. Peninsula with Loons. This again is from up at Lake of the Woods, a reduction block woodcut. This took me about 6 weeks to do. There are 14 colors. Remember, all of this was printed off of the same piece of wood, just one side. Next frame. Beets grew in my garden a couple summers ago. Next frame. Tomatoes, you guessed it, from my garden. Next frame. And then I did this last year at Christmas time. I wanted to kind of revisit the multi-block process. And I sell this also as a print, but I made it into primarily Christmas ornaments and cards. And we'll see this image crop up again later in my step-by-step process portion. Okay, so some of you probably did relief printing when you were in maybe elementary school or junior high or high school. Sometimes when people stop by my art booth or come to a studio tour in my home or something, they ask me, well, is it like rubber stamping? Yes, that's a good analogy. So relief simply means raised surface. And so when you carve and print something and you ink up that raised surface, that's what gives rise to relief printing. How do you do this? How do you start? Every good artist starts with drawing. You can't get away from it. And that's the springboard of all creativity, somebody said. And so sometimes it's many drawings and you pick and choose from many things. And so here you are seeing 4 of the initial drawings that gave rise to some of the prints that you just saw. Next slide. And also, here's some more. These are landscape sketches. What I did is I just took pictures of things out of my sketchbook to show you how some of the prints originated. And then you have to choose your material that you're going to be printing off of. I work with linoleum, either sheet form or on a block or a wood block, but there are other materials that are available also for printmaking using the relief process. Next frame, please. So basically, and here's a very simplified version of how you can do it. You start with a drawing, you trace it on tracing paper, lay it upside down on top of your material that you're going to print from, and burnish over the edge so that the drawing transfers to the block. Next slide. And special carving tools. These are the ones that I'm showing here, are just speedball tools that you would use in a classroom with junior high or high school age students. So they're not super fancy, but they work. And then you would take a brayer, that's a roller that has a very sticky ink that goes over the top, and you ink over what is raised up, lay your paper down on top to start printing, and you can do this without a press. Just take the backside of a wooden spoon and burnish over the top. Next slide, please. And here you can see I'm pulling the print, I'm pulling the page off, and then the image is revealed. Next slide. You can print more than one, you can print on different colors of paper. When an artist finalizes everything they want to do to the block and they have it just right, they can print a whole edition and say, okay, this is print number 5 out of 20. So you can print an edition if you want to, but you don't have to. And then you can experiment with all sorts of different colors of paper and different colors of ink. And you can fade one color of ink into the other, such as you see in these autumn leaves prints here. Next slide. So people ask me, well, how did you get the color in this or whatever? I said, well, I use 3 different methods. So let's take a look at what the methods that I use are. I use the hand coloring method, which is pretty self-explanatory. Some people will color their prints with colored pencil. I choose to use watercolor. So you can see here what the print looks like when it's just black. I just use black ink and then I, sit in color. And I enjoy doing that. It's very meditative. I really do like working with watercolor. But the problem is, every time you sell a print, then you've got to get another one watercolored, so it's a little hard to keep up with that. The multi-block process is a little different. It's pretty obvious what I'm saying when I say multi-block. Every color in the print came off of the face of a different block. But then you have issues of making sure that your blocks are all the same size, that your paper is held in the same position on the block so that it registers with the previous color. And those can be challenging processes. Again, we always start out with our sketch. And of course, it always takes on a different look in the finished work, as you see in the image below. Next slide, please. So for this Christmas ornament print or Christmas card, I did make it into cards as well. I used 3 different wood blocks, but you can use the top and bottom of the wood to print on. So for this one, the first color was just a little branch, as well as the basic brown color of the pine cones. And then the second block, I carved basically the same image into it, but I carved out sections that I did not want to receive ink and used a darker brown to go over it so that the contours of the pine cones showed. The third block, I used green ink, and I used that block just to show the needles. And then all put together, it came out as you see in the corner. But I wanted to give it a little color, a little pop. And so I created a red ink frame on one side of the block, and by itself it prints as you see in the middle, but when all is put together, that's the final result. And the next slide shows you what the finished ornament looks like. So that's the multi-block process in a very simplified version. The reduction block process is when all the colors in succession are printed off of the face of one wood block. So here is what's left of the wood block from which this print came from. Next slide. So here's the progression. And it's a little crazy because while I ran each piece of paper through the press in six different times, I used 8 different colors of ink. So let's examine that. Let's look at number 1. I carved off everything in the print that I wanted to remain the white of the page. So that took some planning. And then I inked the sky with the lightest gray and the water with a very pale blue, because when you look at water and you look at the waves, you see that it shimmers in different colors. And you can see that I kind of faded those 2 colors together. I put that on my papers one at a time, hung them to dry or laid them out to dry. You have to print the whole edition. You can't just do a few, because that block is going to be destroyed. It's going to be reduced, hence reduction block, the further you get into the process. In the second one, you can see how I've carved off the areas I wanted to keep the light gray in the clouds. And I also carved off anything I wanted that light blue in the water. So you can see more of that river showing. And I used a light blue for the sky and a deeper blue for the water, and sent those same papers all the way through my press. And you'll see how I aligned things in a little bit when I show you some video footage. In image number 3, I did something you're not supposed to do, but I had to. I wanted to get some dark bits of blue in the water. The only way I could do that was to do it at this point. So I had carved everything off the sky because I didn't want to get anything up there anymore. I carved that all off. And that which remained, raised up, received this darker blue. In number 4, I carved off anything I wanted to keep the dark blue and went over it with this green, carved off anything that I wanted to keep that light blue, and left raised areas, the contours of the landscape. And there I went over it with a medium green, carved off what I wanted to keep of that color, and that which remained received this darker, it's kind of a purple actually. And so the print is complete. Next slide. So now I'm inviting you into my studio. We'll pretend we're on a studio tour, and I'm going to do a demonstration for you. Although actually I could never do a demonstration for you in the studio of the reduction block process, because it takes so much time and days for ink to dry in between. But we'll do the next best thing. Here's the reduction block process. Again, we start out with drawing and design. You got to spend a lot of time with that, with any art. And then you have to plan your colors very carefully. I find I have to create a step-by-step sequence, a list, a checklist. You have to prepare your block, and you can do this with either linoleum or with a block of wood. You transfer your drawing to it. You you carve off what you want to keep the color of the paper, if anything. You ink it up. You've got to get your paper ready. And then you're always going back to carving and printing repeatedly throughout this. I'll show you how I set up my press, and then I'll show you also the printing process. So I was thinking of this print that I wanted to do to show you. And I knew that at a particular location that I enjoy going to on the Lake of the Woods, that I had done a lot of sketching, and I had photographed the scene many times. So I kind of took those 2 experiences together and created a design. And you see how I worked on a sketch on the left there, and I refined it, and I scanned it, and I cut and pieced things and made things smaller or larger as needed. I actually moved the sun to a little bit different location from how it was in my original photograph. I think I lowered it in the sky a little bit. And then I did a watercolor sketch so I could plan out some colors. So next slide, please. And here's a closer look at that watercolor sketch. And I did do some careful color planning on the right-hand margin of the page. And for a while, at least, I was trying to match those colors. And sometimes when I've done this process, I come pretty close, but I changed my mind as I was working on it. Experienced some happy accidents, and so that was kind of fun. And I literally did make this checklist, and I take great pride in checking it off as I go through. So next slide. And then it's important to get a photocopy to the right size of the block that you want to print on. And so then it's a trip into town for me, and it has to be off of a machine that has a toner that will transfer onto the wood. Now the wood block is, I've been using poplar, but I have printed off of pine before. You just have to make sure that whatever grain of wood you choose to work with, it needs to be tight enough of a grain and yet not too hard to carve. And so now let's take a look at how we're going to transfer this. Basically, I take acetone, or you could use nail polish remover that has acetone in it, and you invert your Xerox copy onto the flat face of that sanded piece of wood, tape it down in place, and then you dip into the acetone. And I like using a natural bristle brush for this because it kind of helps that paper be pushed onto the wood surface a little bit more fully. Sometimes then I take a pencil and I burnish an area to help that image transfer into the wood. You can see here where I've raised that paper up, and you can see a little bit of the image transferring. I'm taking a peek, but let's go to the next slide and let's start the video here. This is on the other side of the print. I don't like to do the design transfer on the whole block at once, because sometimes that ink from the Xerox transfer will bleed a little bit and your drawing gets kind of mushy. So I'm burnishing over it with my hands, and then when I lifted it up, I saw, oh yeah, there's that spot where the tape was. So I put the paper back down again and burnish over it again, peel the tape up and go over it with some acetone. And I'll give you a little bit of a reveal here. It will show you very soon how well that transfers. It's just incredible. And so that works. So now let's go on. I think, yeah, okay. And so this is what the block looked like when I got done. And if an area didn't come through real well, I just took a Sharpie and drew in there. So next slide. And now it's time for carving, and these tools are made in Japan. I buy them from McLean's Printmaking Supply in Portland, Oregon. And I use the various sizes of U gouges and V gouges. Next slide. And you can also use a knife. I sometimes also use a X-Acto knife. Next slide. Just to outline shapes, I mean. Okay, and you can go ahead and start this. This just shows you how I'm starting to carve the sun right here, because I want that to stay the white of the paper. And so I'm using a very small tool. I think it says it's a 1 millimeter size U gouge. And then I flip that block over so I can access that from the other side. So you want to go carefully. You never want to force your knife down in too hard. And then I'm just carving some light areas in the water because the sunlight was reflecting in them. And the first color, let's go to the next one, that I'm going to print is going to be a kind of a golden color. Here's my block ready to go. You can see where it's carved in the water reflection and in the sun. Next slide. And this is my printing press. And because it is called a Vandercook printing press, that's a company that manufactured printing presses at one time, one of the major companies in the world. And because there are some printing gurus in the world that keep track of such things, I was able to, with the help of finding a serial number on my printing press, and look it up and found out that it was built in or manufactured in 1928 Probably made in Chicago, Illinois, although I do think that they did have some manufacturing that took place in Europe. This is called the number 14 proof press. I think they made very, very few of these, probably less than a dozen of these. The only other one just like this I have found is in New Zealand. There might be more. I was able to find out that this was made in Chicago, purchased for resale purposes by a company in Minneapolis, and then purchased by a newspaper in Elbow Lake, Minnesota, where it served most of its life. I purchased it in 2001 from a local artist, Manuel Calanga Hernandez, who knew I was a printmaker and wondered if I'd be interested in having it. I said, yes. So I purchased it from him. And my logo for my art studio is showing below there. And if you look at it, you can see that the logo is based on the appearance of my printing press. Next slide. Oh, for some reason we're missing an image. Okay. So I can show you what was in that slide just by looking at the one that is labeled tympan. You see that round drum area on the printing press, that is called the cylinder. And it, with the handle there, you know, rolls across my press bed. So that is the press bed that is holding the block right there. I have wrapped that cylinder with several layers of a very heavy paper and mylar. That's called packing the cylinder. Next slide. And the reason that you do that is when you lay your block underneath of it, you want it to kiss the surface of your block, but not to press down hard. And to hold my block in place, I built a jig and had some pegs to hold the paper. Next slide. And so now we're going to see this press. And there's the jig. And to put the block at the right height so that I could get a kiss impression, I calculated how much packing I had to do on the press bed and placed my block in place. Next slide, please. Now it's time for me to get my ink ready. Next slide. And go ahead and start the video. I needed to make a very pale golden yellow for the first color. I started with white and add my color to it. And so I'm taking an ink knife. Sometimes people have been amazed that I mix my own colors, but that's really what you have to do. I mean, you start with the 3 primary colors, and from there you can do just about anything along with white. I try not to use black when I don't have to. And I think I've got a good match for a color. Okay, now let's go to the next slide. And I'm going to take a tool called a brayer. It's a rubber roller. Next slide. I have some of various sizes. And in the first video here, you see what's called charging the brayer. So I'm taking my ink and I'm working on top of a tempered glass surface. And I'm taking the brayer and I'm going over that ink. And that's called charging the brayer. I'm seeking to get a nice even ink distribution, but not too heavy. And then in the next video, go ahead and start the inking the block video. Yeah. You can see how with the block of wood inside of the jig that I rigged up, my lockup on my press, I am coating that block of ink, trying to get it on there evenly. Let's go to the next one. And now we're going to put the paper, carefully align it to the holes that I pre-punched into the paper, lay the paper down, roll up the press, voila. So here's the first printing. Okay, and next slide. And that's what it looks like. So next frame. And they hang to dry. Next slide. And that normally I wouldn't be showing you more inking and printing. But for the second layer, I'm using 4 colors that are going to be blended into each other. So I've got them all lined up. Next slide. And let's take a look at the pale yellow. I am putting some pale yellow around the sun. And these have been sped up a little bit because nothing's as exciting as watching paint dry. Now let's go down to pink, not light pink. So yeah, that one, yeah. Okay, and so now I'm taking a light pink and you can see from the bird's eye view there, it was kind of merging into it so it'd have a soft edge. Now we'll go to light pink. That was going to be, most of the sky is going to be kind of light pink, but some of that gold that I put on there before is going to show through a little bit. And then the light pink is, you know how skies are lighter at the top? So that's what I was fading into. And so now I'm putting kind of a mauve color in the water because some of that is going to show through in the water highlights. Next slide. Okay, so that second printing with all the color fading that went on up in the sky looks like the image you see on the left. But then I thought, oh, I wanted more white to be in that shimmer or that reflection of the sun. And so I quickly inked up just a strip of the light, really pale yellow and sent that through my press for the third printing. So let's go to the next frame. In the fourth printing, I did a fade of a pale lavender down to a deeper lavender across the water. And then the fifth printing, I carved a lot of that off. And now just the island is showing here a little bit to the right. In the fifth printing, you can see I've left some of that purple show in the water. Next frame. And it's time to get rid of the background sky. I mean, to this point now, I've been able to ignore that sky for a while and just concentrate on the water, but now it's time to carve that sky off because I don't need to do anything up there anymore, but I do need the trees to start showing. So I outline them with a small knife, or a small carving tool. And then I'm working with the grain of the wood. That is really helpful when you're trying to show water or any kind of carving. It just goes better if you don't fight the grain of the wood. And you can see now I'm gradually going to a bigger gouge. I've gotten away from the detail work, and so now I'm working with a larger size gouge. Next slide, please. And so you can see these are a couple of different stages in the carving process. Haven't done any carving into the rocks there. And then the sixth printing, I made a darker purple and carved up anything I wanted to keep that lighter purple. And you can just start to see some of the trees emerging. I don't have to print them all the time. I don't need them till the end. And then the seventh printing shows just the very darkest color. Next slide. So here is the progression of printing that went on. And you can see that yellow up there shows in the water reflection and around the sun. But other than that, it just kind of gives kind of a warmth to all the other layers because they do kind of show through a little bit. So next slide. So here you have it. This is the reveal of my latest print called Setting Sun. It's a reduction block, and hopefully you've all enjoyed being on the journey with me.
Right. Is that the last slide then?
It is.
Okay, great. Well, I will keep this up in case people have specific questions about it. Thank you, Glenna. That was really awesome to see all those different stages. And I'm going to go check on the chat here. It looks like we might have a couple of questions, but if folks want to unmute themselves and share a video or anything like that, I invite you to do so, and feel free to ask some questions of Glenna while we've got her here.
Glenna, I thought that was the moon, not the sun.
No, did I call it the moon at one point?
I don't know. Maybe I just wanted it to be the moon.
No, it's yeah. No, it's the sun because that direction. Yeah, I know it was the sun.
It's all right, whatever it is. It's lovely.
Thank you for watching, Mary.
You're welcome.
We had a couple questions in the chat. It looks like, I think you may have answered one of them about your preferred wood to carve, and if there are kinds that you avoid. And there's also a question about what you use to sharpen your gouges.
Yes, I knew somebody was going to ask that. I have a couple of special stones that are recommended where I buy my knives through, that I have to be very careful with and not ruin the bevel. I haven't been very good at it, but one thing that has helped is somebody recommended that I get a honing block. So it's a piece of leather on a piece of wood. It's like a leather strop that a barber might have used to sharpen their tools years ago. And that is helpful to keep them sharp so that they don't have to be sharpened so often. And then, but there's different kinds of stones to sharpen them with. And then I can also have them sent away. They can be either shipped to Japan, where they were made, to get the bevel reinstated onto them, or they can do that at McLean's over in Oregon as well.
Brittany had a question about the gouges and if there's a difference between Japanese made gouges and European ones, or what's the appeal of the Japanese versions?
Well, that's a good question. The Japanese have this centuries old tradition of doing wood block printing. And they're just known all over the world. And it wasn't the Western world that even knew about their woodcuts until about the 1870s, when people started traveling more and they saw these amazing woodcuts, and it informed how the European artists, the French Impressionists in particular, did all of their paintings, and they started emulating their style and so on. But the Japanese printmakers just are phenomenal. And so I guess they have honed the skill of making great knives. I don't know anything about European knives. I've never seen them in my printmaking catalogs.
All right, I'm just gonna stop sharing my screen, but pull up the chat here. So and people can also feel free to ask, like unmute and ask these questions. I don't have to read them all. But let's see. We also have a question about what motivated you to move to carving and printing. And what does that bring to drawing itself?
Good question, and I'm glad you brought it up because I wanted to share this. What I like about printmaking above the other kinds of art that a person can do is I can make my composition, make my print, and make multiples, and I have more to sell that way. More than one person can own one of my prints, and they all have an original. It's original printmaking. It's different from something mass-produced in some other way, like a poster printing place or something. This is original art, but it also is often more affordable than getting a one-of-a-kind painting. And so it can have an appeal to the masses. Anybody else have a question?
I have a question.
Yes. Hi, Zach.
Hi, how are you?
I'm great.
Good. Your work is magnificent. It looks exhausting to me. It looks like a ton of work.
It is.
Have you ever tried to do that acetone image transfer onto canvas at all? Would that work?
I have not tried it. It works on linoleum blocks as well. And the great thing about it is that image is just impregnated into the surface, and repeated cleanings doesn't take it off. So it's always there. That's why it's so great.
Okay.
But it might be worth a try. The thing that's important though is to try it with more than one type of photocopier machine, because it's got to have a particular toner for this to work. And I know from experience that not all photocopiers, the imagery will work in an acetone transfer.
Okay.
We had another question about if there are any other projects that you're currently working on. I know we just got to see the latest. Is there anything else in the pipeline?
I have so many other priorities in my life, and so this last year hasn't been real productive in the studio, so I'm just kind of getting back to it now. I've got 2 print designs started. One I've been working on for about 3 or 4 years, and I hope that it gets done for a Christmas print. It's a sleigh ride scene in northern Minnesota, of course. And then another one is the snowy woods, which we have early this year. So I'm thinking, oh, that's a sign. I'm supposed to be working on that print first thing. I know it.
Do you have any other questions? Well, I want to thank everybody for joining us. Really appreciate you taking the time out of another snowy evening, first of many to come, or not first, but yeah, so thank you for being here. Thanks to Glenna for putting together that amazing presentation. I'm really glad that we were recording it because it'll be great to be able to have that. It'll be posted on our website, so anyone, and on our YouTube page, so anyone who didn't get a chance to see it can share that around. So that's great. And yeah, just thanks again to everyone. I'm gonna